Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kent Cloder. I'm one of the associate pastors here at Bethany Community, and I'd like to introduce my senior pastor. What are you laughing at?
Well, you're kind of my senior pastor too.
Well, Daniel Bennett, I appreciate your message yesterday. It was a great word. Daniel preached yesterday on how to test teachers from 1 John, and that was a good word as always.
Praise God.
You talked about 4 essential truths from this passage, and I'd like to talk a long time about this. We got a few minutes, so I'd just like to hit some highlights. One, you talked about the reality in the text, the reality of false teachers, the dangers of false teachers, and the characteristics of false teachers. And next week we're going to talk more about how to handle false teachers, but I'd like to specifically ask you if you would kind of unpack the main theme that you talked about, that we must proactively evaluate false teachers, and that's for every individual, not just for the church. And so one of the things you said was the danger of false teachers is from within. Dangers to the church is from within and not necessarily from outside. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think a lot of times as we think about the dangers that a church faces, we think of the external dangers. And I see a lot of Christians, from Facebook posts to articles they reference to things that they're really thinking about. They're very concerned about these outside forces that are somehow going. And it's true, there are outside forces that are attacking the church.
Sure.
There are people who don't love the church, and so it's absolutely right to be aware of those things and to be aware of them, to pray. Paul tells us to pray for peace. But in terms of the church failing to do what Christ has called us to do, I think that Ian Murray is right whenever he tells us that the New Testament tells us the primary danger to the church comes from within.
Yeah.
And specifically from people who claim to be Christians, telling us things about God, His character, His will, His purposes for us that aren't true. And I don't see evangelicals as concerned as they need to be about the danger of false teachings and teachings and teachers. Instead, I see a reticence, a lack of willingness to discuss the reality of false teachers and the dangers they present.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, history bears it out that the church actually grows when there's pressure from without. Yeah, that's a good word. You also mentioned 10 characteristics of false teachers.
Yeah.
And I thought one of the things that stood out to me during that segment of the message was that you said one characteristic alone is enough to disqualify a false teacher. That seems kind of narrow. Yeah. And I'm just curious, how would you discern when a person crosses that line?
Yeah, that's kind of, those are 2 great questions in one there. So one, it is narrow, and I think what I was trying to go with there is that sometimes a person says, well, here are all the things that are true of a false teacher, and this guy that is involved spiritually in my life, he's only doing 3 of them, so surely he's okay, right? I think we need to, well, first of all, be cautious and say, hey, one characteristic of a false teacher alone is potentially disqualifying. Secondly, for those of us who are teachers, I think we have to say, boy, it's not like, well, I'm doing great on 9 of these areas, so what if my character if my character undermines my message? At least the message is right. And so I think it's careful, it's a caution for those of us who are in positions of spiritual leadership to say, as Paul tells Timothy, I have to watch my life and doctrine closely.
Yeah.
And as I think about how I treat my spouse or how I shepherd my children, I can't just say, well, at least I'm doing well in my ministry. No, it's my life and doctrine, so I have to be careful that I'm not undermining the message and crossing into the territory of a false teacher. Now, in terms of, I got asked this a lot like right off, step on the pulpit. Whenever 3 people in a row ask you the question, you're like, may not have covered that well enough. Like you said, we're going to get into this more next week too. But the question was, okay, how do I know when a guy has crossed that line? And I kind of think of a spectrum. There's kind of several things I'd say. One, there are oftentimes good teachers who teach some things that are incorrect, and they're not false teachers, but they're wrong on some issues. And I would put myself in that category. I'm sure there are things that I'm wrong on. That doesn't make me a false teacher, because the types of things that by God's grace I'm wrong on aren't core essential truths of the faith. There are also some people who are in what I would call kind of a gray area, where, in fact, someone came up to me yesterday and said, you kind of reference this guy. Are you willing to say this guy is a false teacher? And I said, boy, it's kind of like saying, am I willing to say that someone's not a believer? Sometimes you say, okay, they're manifesting characteristics of an unbeliever. But I'm not comfortable saying you are definitely an unbeliever. And the same is true with some guys I put in this camp. Boy, they're really manifesting some of the characteristics of a false teacher. And I would tell them that, but I'm not going to say so-and-so is a false teacher. I know it definitively. I'm just going to say they're manifesting some of those characteristics. And then there's also some people, and maybe you can correct my thinking on this, but there are also some people who I'm confident are false teachers, but it would be unwise for me just to declare them a false teacher publicly, because it would require so much explanation as to why I think. So if I was going to say that, I would need to spend so there's a teacher in Peoria. I've told him at that this staff people at this church, hey, I think you guys are false teachers, and what you're teaching is wrong about God's character and His will, and you're leading people astray. And it was very loving, but I said that. But I wouldn't call this church out by name in our church service, because so much would have to be unpacked,
right.
And it just wouldn't be wise.
It's not productive.
Yeah. But I would say these are characteristics of a false teaching church, and trust people have discernment to realize. And then there's another category where it's clear that people have crossed this line. It's public, and I would say it publicly. And I put the health and wealth gospel preachers into that, and a lot of the guys from the more extreme parts of the emergent church, they just say, you know what, you've crossed the line.
So certainly bottom line in that is just we need to be learning and teaching ourselves and teaching others how to discern.
Right.
But then also to be very gracious in the way we not only discern, but in how we communicate what we have discerned.
Right.
Just being very gracious.
Right.
And we'll talk more hopefully next week then about how to handle false teachers, and look forward to that message. And so thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Lord bless you.